Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Carla Thorpe. I'm the Director of Prevention and Promotion Initiatives here with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and I have the pleasure of being the host for our webinar this afternoon. Just before we get started with our presentation, I'll go through a few housekeeping items. You should be able to hear the audio for today's webinar through your computer speakers. We have muted all of your telephone lines upon entry to the webinar, so we can't hear you, but hopefully you can all hear us. The webinar today is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Mental Health Commission's website in the webinar archive section in about a few weeks' time. If you would like a copy of today's slide deck, it will also be posted on the website and available with the archive of the recording. Throughout the course of the presentation today, we'd invite you to provide comments or suggestions or questions that you have for our presenter. You can do that either using the chat function, which should be on the left-hand side of your screen, or you can also type questions into the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of our presentation today. So thank you for joining us for the webinar on research on suicide and its prevention. We're going to look at what the current evidence reveals and also topics for future research. In Canada, we certainly recognize that suicide is a public health issue and affects people of many ages and many different backgrounds. To address this issue, the Public Health Agency of Canada has developed the Federal Framework for Suicide Prevention on behalf of the Government of Canada and also in collaboration with suicide prevention stakeholders from across the country. This framework builds on the Mental Health Strategy for Canada, which was developed by the Mental Health Commission in 2012. One of the key issues that has been identified by stakeholders during the development of the framework is the lack of alignment in research agendas across the country. This, along with many other issues such as overlaps in research, really limit the opportunity for us to accelerate the use of research and innovation in suicide prevention. A focus on specific and cross-cutting research areas that are most likely to move the field forward is necessary in order for us to optimize the impact of knowledge created and encourage knowledge translation and exchange. So to address this issue, back in June 2015, a meeting was hosted by the Public Health Agency of Canada as well as the Mental Health Commission and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research in Montreal in association with the IASP conference that was held there. That meeting was really the first step in a process of identifying some specific research priorities related to suicide prevention in Canada. We had some great feedback from participants at that meeting, and certainly they expressed a need for a more comprehensive and a more systematic approach to identifying suicide prevention research priorities, and that we also needed to engage a broader range of stakeholders in that process. So in response to that feedback, the Public Health Agency, in partnership with the Mental Health Commission, launched a joint project to build a shared Canadian research and knowledge translation agenda, and that work was initiated in 2016. It's our hope that this agenda will support the needs of research funders, communities, service providers, and decision makers in the field of suicide prevention. I want to acknowledge the tremendous work that's been done from many members of the project team, which includes staff from the Public Health Agency of Canada, including Isabel Giardino, previously Marc-Etienne Joseph, and now his colleague Mitalika Chawla, as well as some of my colleagues here at the Mental Health Commission, including initially Sophia Briard and more recently Ashley Mulligan. We'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of the many members of the advisory committee who are comprised of a diverse group of stakeholders from across the country who've been working with us over the past 2 years on this initiative. As part of this work, the project team contracted Dr. Gustavo Cerecki and Dr. Sylvanne Daniels to conduct a literature review to better understand the current research evidence base in Canada and also its position in the international context. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Daniels here today to present the research findings that have emerged from this review. Dr. Daniels completed a master's degree in France before obtaining a PhD in microbiology and immunology at McGill in 2013. Since 2014, she's been the coordinator of the Quebec Network on Suicide, Mood Disorders, and Related Disorders, which is a provincially funded research network in Quebec, and is directed by Dr. Gustavo Turecki and Dr. Alain Lesage, who I'm sure many of you will know. Over the last 10 years, the network has brought together researchers from diverse areas of expertise who use complementary methodologies and conceptual approaches related to suicide, mood disorders, and the association with substance use disorders. This network strives to support research in suicide and related disorders by encouraging Quebec researchers and others to collaborate and combine their efforts. So we're very pleased to have Dr. Daniels join us here today, and I'll pass it over to her for our presentation.
Hi there. Thank you, Carla. I just wanted to know if people can hear me. It seems like there's quite a bit of complaints about the sound.
I think, Sylvanne, the audio seems great. So whatever you've done on your end seems to be working nicely.
What I did is okay?
Yes, it seems to be very clear.
All right. So I'd like to thank all of you who have taken the time to join us today. As Carla mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the Quebec Network for Suicide, Mood Disorders, and Related Disorders. Our network is funded by Quebec provincial funding agencies, so both in health and in society and culture. And as Carla mentioned, our director is Gustavo Turecki, who is a well-known researcher, very involved in both the national and international communities in suicide research. And so I think his combined features prompted the Mental Health Commission of Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada to request that we conduct a literature review on suicide research in Canada and internationally. So since I'm sure that everybody who's logged in today is already very well familiar with suicide and suicide research and the importance of studying it, I'm not going to elaborate much on the statistics. However, I just wanted to point out that nearly 800,000 people die of suicide every year around the globe, and in Canada, the estimates are around 4,000 people every year. So next slide. So specifically, our mandate from the MHCC and PHAC were to identify particular topics of interest in the field and areas in which Canadian researchers are particularly productive. So to adequately answer those questions, we first needed to evaluate how Canadian research on suicide contributes to the international body of work. And we also wanted to conduct an exhaustive literature review, so between 2000 and 2017. And so we decided to limit our focus to systematic review to improve both the quality of the articles we would assess and also to reduce the number of articles to make it more manageable. So systematic reviews are generally regarded as being a very high-level type of information source because they synthesize knowledge from a variety of primary articles. And so this allows us to access a greater body of knowledge than if we look at individual primary articles. So we also identified a number of themes that were particularly interesting in research, including epidemiology, clinical, demographic, and social factors, biological factors, prevention and screening, treatment and intervention, and follow-up care and postvention, as well as services research. So together, these different types of research avenues really paints a very comprehensive picture of the type of research that generally is being conducted in Canada and also abroad. And although these are very diverse fields, together they're very complementary and do give quite an accurate picture of what kind of things are going on. So to begin the work, we first wanted to situate Canadian research within the international context of research on suicide. So to do this, we first compiled all of the available scientific productions, of Canadian researchers. But as I mentioned, research on suicide is very diverse, looking at biological, social, clinical, psychological factors, among many others. And so this becomes a little bit of an issue in terms of bibliometric analysis of the literature, and it's something that's further compounded by the fact that there are ambiguous terminologies. So the term suicide is often used to refer to cell suicide, so apoptosis. It's also used in the context of treatment for different types of cancer with transduction of suicide genes. So all in all, we found these confounders to be too much to allow us to accurately assess the literature, and decided to use medical subject heading terms, so MESH terms, which have been developed by the National Institutes of Health, as this really provides an important mechanism to disambiguate. So once we made the decision to go ahead with MESH terminology, we needed to restrict our initial bibliometric analysis to the PubMed database. So that's what we did, and we conducted a search of PubMed to identify all articles discussing suicide that were published between 2000 and 2016. And in order to identify which were produced by Canadian researchers, we searched author affiliations for the terms Canada, Canadian, or the names of any of the provinces or territories. So using the search terms, we were able to identify 1,200 publications. And as you can see from this graph, those publications really increased in number. So it went from about 20, just over 20 publications per year in the year 2000 to over 100 publications per year in 2016. So this increase really reflects increasing awareness and interest in conducting robust research on suicide in Canada. So another important aspect to consider when developing a national research program is also what are the mechanisms of funding the research. So to get a sort of a preliminary idea of what types of projects are being funded, we access the publicly available databases from the three major funding institutions in Canada. So that would be CIHR, SSHRC, and NSIC. And we were able to, sorry, I'm having a little technical issue here.
Sorry, Sylvanne, go ahead. We're going to see if we can bring back the presentation slide.
So in order to assess what types of projects were being funded, sorry, I think we have a little, here we go. My mistake. Sorry, I got a little confused there. So, actually, let's take a step back for a second. So we had a number of publications. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. We had a number of publications that we'd identified. So 1,200 publications identified as being issued by Canadian researchers. And when we further analyzed those publications, we were able to redistribute them into the themes of interest that we had previously identified. So the way we did that is that we assembled a library, so a database of publications, and query that library for search terms that were relevant for each of the themes that we're interested in. So for example, for epidemiology, clinical and socio-demographic factors, biological factors, etc. And what we were able to see, which is on this graph here, is that for well-established fields such as epidemiology, clinical factors, and treatment and interventions, there were between 600 and 900 publications overall, whereas in some of the more recent fields, such as biological factors, postvention, and follow-up, there were under 300 publications within that 16-year time frame that we were looking at. So this suggests that this might be avenues where Canadian researchers can perhaps focus some of their attention to really become world leaders. So the next thing that we looked at was how research is being funded. And so in order to assess that aspect, we looked at what were the publicly available funding decisions databases, and the three national funding agencies, CIHR, NSIC, and SSHRC, all hold publicly available databases that we were able to search. So we compiled a list of all the projects funded between the 1999-2000 funding competition and 2016, and identified which of the funded projects were focusing on suicide research. So we initially identified 429 projects and further slimmed that down to 264 after evaluating titles and keywords. And so that totaled nearly $44 million of funding awarded to the different projects. And then when we looked at the breakdown of how these projects fit within the 4 research pillars identified by CIHR, namely biomedical research, clinical research, health systems and services, and socio-cultural or environmental or population health. What we just saw was that the vast majority of the funded projects fit within that last category, so social, cultural, environmental, and population health. And with the 3 other categories sharing just over a quarter of the funded projects. So what we were able to do is that since we constituted a list of funded projects versus publications produced by Canadian researchers within the same time frame, we were able to overlap those 2 pieces of information. And overall, what that showed us was that research productivity was loosely correlated to the amount of funding received. So for most of the categories, such as clinical, biological, prevention and screening, and even to a certain extent services research, there were similar sort of levels of publications as there were research funding awarded. However, there were 2 really striking exceptions to this, which is the epidemiological factors and also the treatment and intervention. And so in both of those cases, the number of publications was much more elevated than what one would have expected based on the amount of funding attributed to those categories. So we have basically 3 theories to explain why that might be. So the first of them is that, first of all, we only queried the PubMed database, and we know that there are a number of fields where scientific productions may not be registered in PubMed. So that might be a question of producing reports or publishing in journals that are not indexed in PubMed. Another potential aspect is that funding might have been obtained elsewhere than from the 3 major funding agencies. It's likely to be particularly true for areas like treatment and intervention research, where partnerships with either NGOs or with private industry might have allowed researchers to conduct studies on treatment and intervention independently of support from the federal funding agencies. And in addition, there are areas such as clinical research and also epidemiology where access to the data is often the hardest hurdle, the biggest hurdle, but then once the data is available, exploiting the data can happen over a number of years, so that might explain that it seems to be disjointed from the direct funding of those particular fields. So next, once we've sort of taken a look at which areas were being well-funded and what types of publications we have coming out of Canadian research labs, we were able to take a look at how that fit into the international context of suicide research. So to do this, we continued our bibliometric analysis with PubMed, and we identified all the publications internationally on suicide between 2000 and 2016. And so that is represented by the gray bars in the graph. And the blue tips at the top of each bar represent the amount or the proportion that is due to Canadian research. So what we were able to see is that the trend of increasing publications in suicide research over time is something that holds true internationally. Yet, if we look at the percentage of the research that can be attributed to Canadian researchers, we see that that amount has tripled in the time frame that we're looking at. So we started at just over 2% in 2000, and by 2015, we're at over 6% of the international literature being ascribed to Canadian researchers. So what we conclude from this is that Canada has really been emerging as an important contributor to the international literature on suicide, and it makes sense to continue to encourage researchers to take that place and to continue to develop their competitiveness. So in terms of that increased representation on the international stage, I think it's something that really holds true across the different themes of interest that we've looked at. So in this graph, the different colors represent different research themes. So epidemiology, prevention, screening, services, clinical and socio-demographic, treatment and intervention, biological factors, and post-vention and follow-up. And what we can see is that although globally there was an increase in terms of Canadian representation across all of these fields, some fields really showed a very marked increase in representation, and so that is particularly in light green, the biological factors, also in red, prevention and screening, and in purple, the clinical and socio-demographic aspects. So those really appear to be key strengths of the Canadian research community in suicide. All right, so the next step, once we had looked at how Canada really situates itself compared to the international context, was to look at what type of literature is being produced in suicide and suicide prevention. So this is a really ambitious project since we were looking at a very large time frame, so between the years 2000 and 2017, and we're looking at all types of research on suicide. As you can imagine, our initial research gave us nearly 2 million hits. I think it was 1.8 million hits originally. So we really needed to define some clear inclusion and exclusion criteria to make this project manageable. We're going to get into that in a second. Once we were clear on what were our criteria, we constituted a reference library. We spent quite a bit of time cleaning up that library, and then we assessed the articles individually. And I'm going to also mention some of the limitations that are linked to this methodology that we use. I think they're important to bear in mind as we look at the conclusion. Okay. So in terms of our inclusion and exclusion criteria, the first step was that because of the large number of hits that we had initially, we decided to limit ourselves to systematic reviews and meta-analyses, since they would be able to address suicide and suicide-related outcomes that are already at a sort of consensus stage, because we're looking at multiple primary articles at once. So in terms of suicide-related outcomes, we're really looking at suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, self-harm, self-injury, or deliberate self-harm. There's a variety of vocabulary in the literature, but these are the terms that we selected and that we checked. We also included only articles published in 2000 and onwards, and we looked at articles written in English or in French. So our exclusion criteria was any publication dates that were up to and including 1999, any publications that were in languages other than English or French, articles that discussed homicide, suicide, unless suicide was really addressed as an independent outcome. We also excluded articles that were focused on medically assisted dying, on non-suicidal self-injury, or on mental illnesses that were not directly related to suicidal behavior. So then to constitute our reference library, we'd initially wanted to use a large number of sources, but with our initial query of 10 different databases, we had millions of hits, so we decided to restrict our search to 3 key databases. So we used the PubMed database, and then we searched in complementary databases. So PubMed tends to be focused more heavily on biological aspects and clinical aspects. We used the Psych Info database as a complementary source, which would have more of a focus on psychosocial aspects. And we also use the CNOW database, which has a focus on nursing initiatives, as we thought that that was also an important aspect of suicide research in Canada. So once we've searched those 3 databases, we prepared a merged library, which had 4,500 hits. And through multiple steps, we eliminated all the duplicate entries to obtain a final count of 3,542 hits. And so, you know, again, we had a very large number of articles retained in our search, and we expected this based on the wide scope. So to move forward, we, as I mentioned previously, we decided to focus on systematic reviews and meta-analyses, But we also excluded data that was specific to non-North American countries. And we also made the decision to proceed as a scoping review with perhaps less emphasis on specific findings and more of an emphasis on where the bulk of the literature is located. So once we split these articles into meta-analyses and systematic reviews, we eliminated many of the hits, and then we excluded the articles that we deemed irrelevant or country-specific. And at this point, we were left with 828 articles, and we redistributed those articles into the major themes that we'd identified, so biological, clinical, epidemiology, prevention and screening, treatment and intervention, follow-up, care and postvention, and services research. And so at this point, I would like to clarify that we attributed articles to these categories in the non-exclusive way. So that means that there could be a single article represented in 2 or even 3 categories if the article discussed different aspects of suicide research. So as a further cleanup to the library, we grouped the titles into the relevant themes, and then we analyzed them individually. So we continued removing articles as we went through. Whenever we would come across articles that either upon further inspection were not relevant or focused on non-North American populations. We also had to exclude some articles because they did not have a clear methodology. It was not possible upon reading the article to assess whether or not they had really conducted the review in a systematic way. So whenever those articles were identified, we excluded them from a further analysis. And so just to give you an idea, by the time we had finished cleaning everything up, we reached 775 articles approximately. So once we finished resorting everything, we were able to also assign a value to whether or not the article had any Canadian content or authorship. So authorship was defined as whether any author of the review had Canadian affiliation reported. And for content, we assigned Canadian content to any article that specifically reported to Canadian data, or if they had a table and in the table they specifically mentioned that the data was obtained in Canada, then we were able to mark it as containing Canadian content. And then we went on to compile the main findings and recommendations for each of the sections. And these were done by basically compiling the findings and recommendations from the individual articles that we looked at. And for the recommendations, we really focused on things that were consensus recommendations that multiple authors would suggest for future research. So some of the limitations of this methodology are the fact that because we only included articles that synthesized original research in a systematic way, that means that we did not include expert reviews or primary publications. So the advantage, of course, is that we had consensus data, but there's a bias against certain subject areas where systematic reviews and meta-analyses are perhaps not the go-to methodology. And there's also a bias towards quantitative research and scientific journals. So because we were aware of that potential bias, we made an attempt to use complementary databases whenever possible, and we included articles that specifically mentioned that they use qualitative approaches or that they included gray literature in their searches. So some of the other limitations were pertaining to the fact that in the reported major findings and recommendations, for most of the sections, those were built on recommendations to meta-analyses. And then when we had fewer articles available, then we also included systematic reviews in the formulation of the major findings and recommendations. But we prioritized meta-analyses when they were available. And another aspect of this is that we identified our systematic reviews and meta-analyses by querying our library of 3,500 hits with a number of keywords. So there is a risk of omitting certain articles if those specific keywords have not been used. And then, as I mentioned, some areas of research do not produce systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So, and then the final aspect of some of the limitations here are that whenever we report Canadian data or Canadian authorship, we're basing this on what the information is available to us when we look at the systematic reviews and the meta-analyses. So Canadian data was only flagged when the authors made a specific point to explicitly mention the country of origin of the studies, but that is not necessarily done in every single systematic review or meta-analysis. So it's possible that we missed some articles that perhaps were using very important Canadian data but did not specify. And then in terms of Canadian authorship, we're really discussing the authors of the systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So these are not necessarily the people producing the primary data. So it's also an important aspect to keep in mind. So with all those caveats in place, we were able to, through this huge amount of work, we were able to compile the results, the overall results of our literature search. And so we really put this all into a table to collapse down the information. So I would just like to point out that the table is very, it's a synthesis of all of the articles that we analyzed. So there are, of course, slight variations from one article to another, but if you were to go down to the primary level, I'm sure there would be a much wider variation. But what we reported here are the consensus points that came out of our search. So being male increased the risk of suicide, whereas being female increased the risk of suicidal behavior. Being an adolescent, having a history of suicidal behavior, or having a family history of psychiatric disorders and suicide all increase the risk of suicide for a given individual. Any exposure to violence, such as bullying or child abuse, raise the risk of suicide. There's also an increased risk of suicide during spring and summer months. Any alcohol and drug use, particularly histories of substance abuse problems, were associated with increased suicide risk. People receiving inpatient care or people who were incarcerated were at increased risk. Internet and media information were associated with an increased risk in many cases, particularly when there's exposure to sensationalized reports of celebrity suicide. Comorbid disorders were also highly prevalent among the risk factors. So psychiatric disorders, particularly with affective disorders, substance use disorders, psychotic disorders, personality disorders, and anorexia, traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, attention deficit disorder, and conduct disorder, all being particularly highlighted. So some of those are specifically highlighted in the context of children and youth, so bipolar, attention deficit disorder, and conduct disorder. Other brain disorders were also associated with increased risk of suicide, such as traumatic brain disorder, intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, and cognitive deficits or decline, particularly in the elderly. Some of the other risk factors identified were what we call somatic or physical conditions, so being underweight, having any type of physical pain, having undergone a previous abortion, or being HIV positive were all associated with increased suicidal ideation, suicidal behavior. Belonging to minority groups is also considered to be a suicide risk. So in some cases, the country of origin of immigrants increase the risk of suicide. Belonging to sexual minorities, such as being lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or belonging to an indigenous population, were all considered to be risk factors for suicide. So I just wanted to specify that for the sexual minority, there are articles looking at transgender and sexual questioning, However, those articles did not filter through to systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So that's why we didn't specify it here. In terms of occupation, being a physician, especially a female physician, increased the risk of suicide, and also being a police officer or first responder were associated with increased risk of suicide. Socioeconomic situations such as marital status, being young and unmarried, increased suicidal behavior. Socioeconomic insecurity, unemployment, lower education, family structure, maternal emotional unavailability, and being separated or divorced were all contributors to suicide risk. And additionally, personality and psychological traits such as hopelessness, impulsivity, neuroticism, and anxiety, as well as some of other social factors such as loneliness and recent life events, were all contributors to increased suicide risk. So conversely, we were also able to identify a number of protective factors. So among these were internet and media information. So I know I had this in the risk factors as well, but in some cases, access to the internet and media information could be protective if it was used to obtain constructive information on mental health and on health seeking. Physical conditions such as being overweight appear to be protective. Belonging to minority groups, so this one I mentioned again in the risk factors as well as in the protective factors. And so what we see with immigrant populations is that they tend to carry their risk with them. So if they immigrate from a country with high risk of suicide, then they will have an increased risk of suicide compared to non-immigrants, whereas if they've immigrated from a country with low suicide risk, they will tend to have a lower suicide risk than non-immigrants. So in terms of socioeconomic situation, having a loving parent-child relationship is protective. Having reasons for living, social connectedness, a sense of belonging, and belonging to a religion were all protective components as well. And finally, a number of different treatments were associated with protection against suicide. So these included SSRI treatment, ketamine, listamine for mood disorders, dialectic behavioral therapy, internet-based CBT and depression, follow-up interventions, and active contact and follow-up. So based on all of these results, many of the authors of the systematic reviews and the meta-analyses made a number of recommendations, and some of those recommendations really overlap with one another. So we highlighted those ones here, and the two big ones were to produce more data to be able to properly draw conclusions. So one of the problems is that to understand the mechanisms leading to suicidal behavior, you need to be able to compare data from one study to another. And it's important to understand the biological mechanisms and the psychological mechanisms to be able to support appropriate treatment and follow-up for all individuals, but especially among youth, ethnic and cultural minorities, sexual minorities, and the elderly. There's also calls for a better understanding of the different subgroups that might be more vulnerable to suicide, and also to better study and understand suicidal behaviors and how those relate to suicide. So another conclusion was that predicting suicide risk remains elusive. So it continues to be a very difficult aspect. So as I was saying, further characterizing the differences between subpopulations is probably an important aspect of this, being able to distinguish between risk factors that will be of importance to, for example, somebody living with schizophrenia versus somebody living with depression. And then another aspect of this is to really follow up on biological and clinical factors that have been previously identified. In many cases, factors are identified as being associated with either suicide or suicidal behavior, but the lack of follow-up studies means that never really goes anywhere. And so some of the recommendations for future research were also pertaining to prevention and intervention trials. So many of these trials have actually produced very promising findings, but sometimes these are inconclusive because of methodological differences between the different studies, or at times inadequate reporting of trial and methodology information that make it very difficult to further analyze the results in the context of a systematic review or a meta-analysis. So there are also calls to have more adequately powered longitudinal studies. So these studies should really be carried out over longer periods of time to really get a better grasp on how suicide risk accumulates over time and how different factors might come into play. And as such, one of the calls was, in addition to having longer periods of time, was also to incorporate more biological, psychological, and social variables to have a full picture of what is happening in individuals who are at increased risk of suicide. And then finally, to harmonize methodology across studies, regardless of the research streams, this would be really helpful to have more meaningful systematic reviews and meta-analyses over the long term. So in the little box here, we have the key aspects of recommendations for future research, which include improving comparisons and conclusions, improving the likelihood of inclusion within systematic reviews and meta-analyses, and really to facilitate policy changes and public health initiatives by providing strong evidence. So I would like to thank all of you for your time and to acknowledge both the research networks, the RQSHAs that I work for, and our director, Gustavo Trecki, as well as the funding agencies, and of course the Mental Health Commission of Canada, Health Canada, and FAC.
That's great. Thanks, Sylvanne, so much for your presentation. I think it was really informative and really incredible that you were able to distill down this work into such a succinct summary, as you mentioned, starting with 1.8 million hits, and I know the full report that you produced was about 400 pages, and we struggled to get that down to a summary paper of about 25 or 30 pages, so that's a really excellent overview. So we've got some time now to take some questions, so I would invite people in the Q&A box, if you can type in your questions, they'll come to us directly and we can summarize them and share them with Dr. Daniels. We have a few that have come in so far, so maybe we'll start with those and give people an opportunity to submit some additional questions as well. So we've had a couple of questions that touch on the issue of childhood trauma and its link to suicide, and I know that you mentioned it briefly in the list of risk factors that you reviewed, but I'm just wondering if you can maybe comment a little bit more on some of the research findings that you found specifically around the link between childhood trauma and suicide.
Sure. So I think that childhood abuse and trauma are recognized as being really important features of the development of suicide risk. And as I mentioned, in the context of our review, we did not really go down into the nitty-gritty of all the findings and mainly focused on the broad areas where research is available. But what we do know about the impact of trauma is that it affects not only the psychological development, but also the biological development of an individual, makes them more susceptible to stress. And that being said, there is incredible variation among individuals, and so some people are able to go through traumatic events and be incredibly resilient, and others are, when they're exposed to trauma, they are more vulnerable to developing psychological disorders and suicidal behaviors as an adult. But it's definitely widely accepted as a key contributor, whether you're coming at it from a psychological, social, or a biological, clinical point of view.
That's great. And one of the other risk factors that you talked about was the family structure. And I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on that, and what were some of the family structures that were seen to potentially put people more at risk as opposed to being a protective factor?
Right. So again, it sort of depended on what type of research was being, or rather what was the way that the research was constructed. So what was typically seen was that individuals who were in a supportive family structure with open dialogue tended to have a lower risk of suicide, and this is something that came out in a variety of types of studies. But for example, one was in families where, or for individuals who belong to sexual minorities, when they had an open, trusting relationship with their parents, it was easier for them to come out, and they tended to have less long-term stress as adults and less likely to develop psychological disorders. Whereas in families that were more rigid, it tended to be more difficult to communicate those types of things. There's also a few studies that were looking specifically at the concept of family honor and having ascribed roles in the family, and in that sense, is sometimes the overly rigid assignment of roles within families could lead to an increased risk of suicide. What is that? Summary of this question.
Yeah, I think the question was maybe also trying to look at, although you listed that separately, that coming from a family where there's been a separation or divorce can also have an impact as well. We had another question as well. You had mentioned that the suicide rates tend to go up in the spring and the summer, and a question about whether the research says anything, about why the rates may go up in the warmer temperatures.
Right. So this is something that has been observed a number of times in epidemiological studies. And although it's very interesting, it's rather inconclusive in terms of what is the mechanism, but I'm happy to share with you what some of the theories are, as I find them to be particularly interesting myself. One aspect is the fact that it actually appears to be in the transition period between the seasons. That seems to be what destabilizes people, and as I remember correctly, there's about a 2-week lag in between the time when the weather starts to improve and when suicide rates peak. And so one of the proposed mechanisms is actually in terms of the exposure to sunlight, that over the winter, very little exposure to sunlight, and then the change that sometimes can occur quite suddenly in the spring somehow triggers suicidal crisis in people who are vulnerable. It's unclear what exactly is the mechanism behind that, but that was one suggestion. And then another one is that somehow the release of pollen in the springtime might influence the risk of suicide. So there might be some immunological aspects at play as well. And so even though it's not, it's only somewhat substantiated, it is something that's been observed a number of times and in many different contexts. And it's also corroborated by studies looking at latitude. So the further up, latitude and altitude actually, but the further up towards the Arctic circles that we get, the more that the suicide rates tend to increase in the spring to when there's sudden changes.
That's really interesting. We have another question that there's been a few variations of this question, but essentially the question is about the link between non-suicidal self-harm and suicide. And, is there a connection? Is it possible for someone who's self-harming for that to escalate to suicide? I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Right. So that is it's a very interesting but also difficult question. It's not clear right now to what extent non-suicidal self-injury associates with suicidal behavior. They are increasingly considered to be sort of independent events. Even within the context of individuals who have suicidal ideation or who engage in suicidal behaviors, the majority of them will not go on to die by suicide. And the link with non-suicidal self-injury does not appear to be linear. So I cannot really answer the question. I think that more and more we consider them to be different things. That does not mean that somebody who engages in non-suicidal self-injury is not at risk of suicide. It just means that it's not as simple as saying that somebody who engages in non-suicidal self-injury is automatically at very high risk of suicide.
Okay, that's great. There's another question that's come in again around the risk factors, and under exposure to violence, you had also included bullying in that list. And the question is whether or not it's being bullied or whether being a bully is also a risk factor as well.
So both aspects appear to be risk factors. I cannot say that bullying is necessarily a field that I'm an expert in, but from what we saw when we were going through the studies, it seems that both being a bully and being bullied were associated with increased risk of suicide, and that also individuals who bullied often had been bullied as well. So I think it's not necessarily that easy to distinguish between the two subsets. But definitely anybody involved in a bullying situation is at risk, and so deserves some sort of intervention.
Okay, and I know that we don't have the best Canadian data around suicide rates by occupation, but you did find a few in the research, including female physicians, police, and first responders that were at higher risk. Are there other occupational groups that fall into that category? And there's a few questions specifically about dentists as an example, where maybe there's been sort of anecdotal talk about them being perhaps at higher risk.
Right. I certainly grew up hearing that as well. However, I have not yet come across any studies that were able to corroborate that dentists were at increased risk. So if there is data to that effect, it certainly has not made its way up to any of these consensus reviews that we looked at.
Okay, well that's something we're certainly going to continue to lobby for better occupational level data in Canada. I think it would be helpful for the field in terms of helping us to pinpoint some of our suicide prevention efforts and knowing, are there certain sectors or occupations that may be at higher risk. There was another question as well on the list of protective factors this time. One of the ones that you listed was being overweight, and the question is whether or not there's any ideas about how that may play a role in terms of being a protective factor for folks.
So there is a suggested mechanism, but I would be I would take it with a grain of salt. I think that a lot more research needs to be conducted. But there is some evidence that having low levels of specific lipids, I believe it's some phospholipids, triglycerides, and also cholesterol especially, are associated with higher risk of suicide. I don't think that there's necessarily a very clear mechanism proposed either, but a number of correlational studies have shown that, so I believe that would explain why the inverse would also be true. So, right, it's polyunsaturated fatty acids. So low levels of polyunsaturated fatty acids and cholesterol are both associated with a higher suicide risk.
Interesting. Again, back to some of the protective factors, you had a list of different treatments that includes SSRIs. We did have a question about whether or not those could also be helpful in terms of being prescribed to children and youth. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Right. So this is definitely a topic that has been the subject of much debate. There have been some studies that associated SSRI treatment and use with higher suicidal ideation. However, I think that overall the data has been showing, so especially data from large populational cohorts. I think there are a number of studies in some of the Scandinavian countries and in European countries that have shown that overall a child who is depressed is ultimately going to be at higher risk of suicidal behavior than a child who is treated. So Treatment with SSRIs, especially in youth, definitely requires close monitoring. The appearance of suicidal ideation with SSRI treatment is possible, but is often transitory. It's usually at the start of treatment. So I think that most of the experts that you could talk to, who are pediatric psychiatrists, would all recommend using SSRIs in a child who really needs it, but under close monitoring.
Okay, I know we have a lot more questions that are coming in. We'll only unfortunately have time for one more, but we do have a couple of questions that have come in on the topic of upstream prevention strategies. So I'm wondering if you have any recommendations there. Either has some research been done on this front that would be helpful, or is there anything that you would recommend that people explore further that are interested in upstream prevention?
Right. So I think that this is a little bit perhaps outside of the specific scope of this work that we did. However, when we looked at some of the risk factors that we've highlighted, especially in terms of social aspects of suicide risk, I would think that there would be some justification for exploring protective measures that encourage better communication within families, support for families who may be struggling, and of course support for marginalized groups. That being said, I think any study, and perhaps some of the limitations to some of the studies that have been done in the past, is that interventions or initiatives are not necessarily, I'm not sure how to say this, when they're carried out, they need to be monitored from the beginning all the way through to the end with follow-up studies to see what are the long-term impacts. So many social interventions that may be very beneficial, unfortunately, are simply lacking data to make them be followed up in terms of policy. So if anybody is planning on running studies looking at supportive interventions, it's really important that the before, during, and after are well described and quantified, so that if their intervention is successful, that they can really make the case for expanding those interventions. I think that's something that was really clear in the literature, that interventions that for example, in Aboriginal populations, Indigenous populations, interventions targeting those groups specifically seemed to work on a small scale, but there was not enough quantifiable evidence to scale them up. So I think that's really something that should be explored further.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Daniels, for your presentation today and staying with us to answer so many questions. We're really grateful that you were able to join us. And maybe just before we wrap up, a few notes to those of you on the line, just to let you know that our next webinar in the area of suicide prevention is taking place on June the 10th. On that particular webinar, we're going to focus on how we can help decrease physician burnout and support professional practice, and certainly a part of that webinar will be focused on how we can address physician suicide, which we heard today is one of the occupations that's at higher risk. So we will be sending out invitations to that session very shortly. At the end of this webinar, we also wanted to let you know that we will be directing you to a brief evaluation survey, so we would really appreciate if you could take a few minutes just to provide us with some feedback. That's very helpful to us as we're planning future webinars, so that we can focus them on topics that are important to you as well. So you will get a thank you email that will contain a link to the evaluation survey. So as we close today's webinar, I wanted to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, including our colleagues who are joining us from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And a special thank you to our guest speaker today, Dr. Sylvanne Daniels, who shared with us some very complex material, but in a very succinct way that was, I think, really easy for people to understand and digest. And thank you again to the team from the Commission who's been working here behind the scenes answering questions during the chat and helping things to run smoothly. So Thank you again, Dr. Daniels and everyone for being on the line, and we look forward to hosting you again on June the 10th. Have a wonderful afternoon.